Hi, it's Richard from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting I have pleasure in bringing you the next chapter in our Decision Services training. Now, this chapter is slightly different than the others because the majority of the content is in the demo, because there's only so much talking about a REST API that you can do without actually using it. Nonetheless, let's take a look at the agenda. We'll introduce the concept of REST API for decision services. We'll highlight some differences with perhaps what you've seen before in terms of REST API. And then we'll go into the mechanics of using Postman, a well-known tool for REST API testing. We'll show you how to authenticate so that you can actually make calls using Postman. And we'll show you how to use Swagger UI to generate, or at least create templates so that it makes it easier for you to call your services, especially when they have complex inputs. The decision services allow us standard REST-based access via our contracts. So each decision service, you define an input and output contract, and you leverage the input contract as part of your REST API. You inject data into the service using the input contract, and if all goes well, you get the output data out in the format as defined by your output contract. Like everything else pretty much in Oracle Intelligent Advisor, all of these calls to a decision service will require authentication. So you can either make the call individually or separately to the API/version/auth, or you can add authorization to your service call when you're using Postman, for example, or indeed any other tool for that matter. One slight difference is that both projects and deployments can be accessed. So for example, you haven't yet deployed anything, but you're on version 36 of your decision service in the development cycle, and you wish to call version 36, it is possible to do so because the project-based API has a project version, which you can see in the highlighted section underneath. And then when you finally get around to deploying it, you will be referencing it by the deployment name. So for all of the demos, we're going to be using Postman. You can use SOAP UI, and there are a bunch of other tools. Postman is the most well-known tool and is the easiest to install. And we'll also use Swagger Hub and Swagger UI to help us document our different decision services and retrieve example structures. As we mentioned before, every call that you make is going to need to be authenticated. So the easy way to do it in Postman is to link the authentication to the service call, or indeed to a collection of service calls, and then just reuse the authentication token each time you make a call. And this is the same process as you've seen if you have already in other Oracle Intelligent Advisor web services. This means that in order to follow the exercise that I'm going to show you, you would need to have an API client defined that it has decision service access. Swagger UI is by no means a prerequisite, but it's a very useful tool for documenting decision services and, of course, for understanding what your input contract is going to look like in JSON. Again, a slight difference to existing APIs is that the decision service automatically provides you with both a one-shot and a batch API. So you'll just notice that the batch has /batch on the end, and it will take an array of objects, each object representing one input contract. So in the screenshot you can see here, I have two objects. The first being current date, 15th of March, and the person having a date of birth in March. The second one, the same, but you can see it's considered to be a second person. And the REST batch API, the output is an array of JSON objects as well. So you can see here in the output, I have one person age 52 and the second person age 17, and the results are different because they are two instances of an object. So as I said, this was going to be slightly different to all the other chapters. We've covered off three really important points. One, that you can run decision services even before they're deployed. So you have a URL for running decision services in their project state, and then another one for running them in their deployed state. And finally, we also talked about how each call needs to be authenticated and how you are provided automatically with a one-shot and a batch API URL. So everything's rolled up into one with decision services. So in the demo, we're going to look at getting hold of the definition file, putting it in Swagger, putting it in Postman, and using those tools to create our first decision service call and populating the input and looking at the output. So in the first part of this demonstration, we'll look at obtaining the necessary files and setting up the authentication to be able to make a call using Postman. We'll also discuss and demonstrate how to make a call to a deployed decision service versus how to make a call to a development version of your decision service. So I'm back in the decision service I used in the previous chapter. And as you can see, in terms of development, I have already got one committed development version, and I'm busy developing version 2. In terms of deployments, however, this has never been deployed. So I'm going to go ahead now and deploy it. To make my life easier, I'm going to give it a slightly different name in terms of the deployment will be called AR_DEP_RN. And as you can see, I'm deploying the development version 1. So that's my version that has been deployed and activated. So I now have a development version, which is ongoing in here, and the deployed version over in deployments. Let's just go and check that everything has gone according to plan. There it is. There's my deployed service. Yeah, good. So let's go back to our project. And let's consider that we want to now run a decision service call in REST, and we want to target this particular version that we're in development, that's in development, or perhaps the previous version. But let's focus on development first of all. I'll go to Actions and say Run via REST, and wait a few moments for the information screen to pop up. As we discussed earlier, it is possible to use the Run via REST as a kind of contract-based tester, as you can see down here where it says try it. But I'm going to focus on this part to begin with. So we have a number of things that we can do. First of all, we can download a Swagger specification file. So I'm going to download my Swagger specification file, and I'm going to put this is account risk Swagger JSON, just so I don't get them all mixed up. There it is. So I've downloaded the Swagger specification, and I also have here the authentication endpoint, which I will need to call in order to be able to obtain an authentication token to in turn be able to call one of these two. So these two are the actual calls. This is the single shot and this is the batch version. As you can see in the single shot, we have draft or latest, which is proposed at the end. But as I mentioned way back in, I think, chapter 2, we could change this to a specific version. Notice how the URL contains the project name and is not using the deployment name that I showed you a moment ago when I deployed it. So let's first of all look at why you might want to use the Swagger file that I just downloaded. I'm over here on Swagger Hub, and I'm going to import the Swagger file. After a brief delay, you can see that the file has been imported, and we can see that it's actually, the Swagger file contains definitions for both the one-shot and the batch. Let's stick with the one-shot to begin with, and you'll notice that perhaps the biggest bonus of using Swagger Hub is that I now have an example body that I can use in, for example, Postman when trying to construct a call to this decision service. And if I look down, I will see the responses will be in this form. So Swagger Hub is great for documenting and great just for generating predefined or example values for your body. So we'll be using this in just a moment. Let's now go to Postman. I'll move it down a little bit so it's a little easier to see. There we go. And in Postman, I'm going to create a new request. But to create a new request, to stay organized, I'm going to create a new collection. So this is going to be risk analysis collection. And when you create a collection, it's essentially just a folder. And one of the things you can do is associate authentication with this folder. So I'm going to select the correct value for decision services, which is OAuth 2.0. And when I scroll down, there's a bunch of information here. And one of the things I can do is edit the configuration. And when I scroll down, I can enter the URL for the token and the ID and the password. Just to remind you, that is the bearer token URL that you can see here and the username and password of my API client. So now that I have associated this with my collection, I'm going to go ahead and create a new request. So each collection can have many requests. And I'm going to send a post request, and I'm going to send it to, initially, this web service URL. So a call to this web service in its development state in its latest version. And I'll pop that in there. I'll make sure that in the authorization it says in. When it comes to the body, the joy of using Swagger is I can now simply copy that. Make sure that I select raw JSON and paste this in here. So the account type, transaction limit, and person addresses are what I need to provide. So I'm going to provide one person whose address is in Ireland. The account, the transaction limit, I'll put in 1,000. And since I have a very bad memory, I'm going to go back in here and look at the account type and say managed funds will be my account type. If I wanted to, I could add multiple people. And let's put in France. So I've used Swagger to help me generate the standard request. I've ensured that authorization is inherited or added to my request. And now I'm ready to click send. I'll go to authorization. I'll select OAuth 2.0 and I'll select token is generated. I'll decide to use it. And I can send my request. And I have my response. If I return to my Intelligent Advisor Decision Service and select version 1, if I want to call a specific version, I can change draft or latest and replace it, for example, with version 1. So I could now return to my decision service, make a change to my service, commit the change. So I've now committed version 2, return to Postman, verify that I'm running version 2, and send, and obtain the response, and compare it with version 1. Now, in my case, there won't be any difference, but the ability to swap between the versions and make multiple calls to be able to compare the behavior of versions is exceptionally useful. Returning to the REST URLs, the batch version, which has a slightly different URL, as you can see. If I go to Swagger and I take a look at the batch version, we can see that the main difference is that I have an array of objects rather than a single object. So I'll pick up that. I'll create a new HTTP request. We'll call it, we'll go and get the URL. And we'll set up authentication as per. And in the body, we'll go ahead and copy the batch version, making sure to choose raw JSON. Bring that down. So we can now add multiple instances to our batch request. So we'll do the first one as transaction, the second one as savings, transaction limit 10,000, transaction limit 100,000, and we'll choose the first two in the list. So now we have two instances of our input dataset. We'll make sure that we've added batch to the end of it. We can also change the version number, but for now I'm going to leave it at draft or latest and run the batch. And we have two outputs representing each case of the batch. Finally, we'll return to our decision service and check out the deployed version. So the deployed version has its own specific endpoints. And you'll notice that these endpoints use the deployment name. But as before, we have the single shot, batch, bearer token, which hasn't changed, and the Swagger definition, which hasn't changed. So let's choose to use the single shot just for the purposes of this demo. We'll add a new HTTP request to this. We'll return to Swagger. We'll go to the single shot version, copy that, verify that we've got the necessary token, and fire off our request. And we've obtained our result. So in summary, we've been able to create calls to the deployed project, but also to the batch version of the development project, the single shot version of the development project, with either draft or latest or a version number. We've also been able to use Swagger Hub to help us get hold of sample body. And we've been using these pages to identify the correct URLs and the other information we need to be able to call our decision services, whether they be deployed or projects. That's about it for our little demo. See you in the next chapter.